There was a time when walking out the front door meant you were gone. No signal broadcasting your location. No obligation to check in. Just an unspoken understanding that you'd be back when the day ran out of light. If you were born somewhere in that stretch between the late 70s and the mid, you grew up in a world that has since been demolished and then spent your adult life building inside the one that replaced it. You're not Gen X. That generation had the luxury of forming entirely before any of this arrived. But you're not Millennial either. They were practically raised by the internet. You landed in the gap between those two realities. And gaps, for all their usefulness, are uncomfortable places to live. Identity needs ground to stand on. A culture, a cohort, a shared reference point, but yours kept shifting. Too young to wear Gen X detachment naturally, too rooted in the physical world to feel at home in the digital one. So you developed something quieter than belonging. The ability to move between spaces without planting a flag in either. You remember penciling a cassette reel back into tension. You also remember the strange electricity of your first email address. Both of those memories live in you with equal weight. And that's the thing. Holding a before and an after inside, the same mind shapes how you understand change, not as threat, not as inevitability, as something you've already survived once. You were a child in an age of empty afternoons. Nothing scheduled the hours, nothing streamed into them. Boredom wasn't a malfunction. It was the baseline condition of being young. So you filled it. Sticks became weapons. Driveways became circuits. The backyard became whatever you needed it to be. Psychologists now have language for what your brain was doing in those stretches, the default mode network. The mind turning inward, recombining, generating. You just called it a Tuesday. You also learned to wait for photographs to exist, for a song to find you, for a friend to shot at the corner because once you'd both left home, there was no reaching each other. Waiting wasn't suffering. It was simply the texture of time. And inside that texture, something developed a tolerance for nothing, a comfort with uncertainty, an understanding that arrival cannot always be forced. Your social life had no backup layer. Everything happened in person, in real time, with no record and no escape hatch. You learned to read tension in someone's posture before the words came. You learned to stay in the room after things went wrong, because leaving didn't erase anything, it just postponed it. And then there was solitude, the uncomplicated kind, being alone with your own thinking, nothing competing for the frequency. That kind of quiet is nearly inaccessible now. But you were shaped inside it, and it left a residue, the ability to sit still without reaching for something, to think without prompting, to exist for a moment without being watched. Then adolescence arrived, and so did everything else. The shift wasn't gradual. It didn't observe your developmental timeline, right in the middle of the years when identity is most porous, most unfinished, most asking the world restructured itself around a new nervous system. One year, the phone was an object fixed to the kitchen wall. A few years later, there was a humming portal in the corner of the room and a dial-up screech that announced a new era like a foghorn. You were old enough to remember what came before, young enough to become fluent in what followed. That combination is psychologically unusual. You learned languages, the language of physical presence, of eye contact and shared silence and reading a room, and the language of digital mediation, of usernames and typed tone and selves that could be drafted and revised. You didn't grow up breathing the internet. You went there, you logged on, and crucially, you logged off. There was a door. You knew where it was. The boundary between your physical life and your online one was real enough to feel almost architectural, but adulthood eroded it. Slowly, then completely. Work migrated online. Friendship migrated online. Memory migrated online. And one day you looked for the door and it wasn't there anymore. What used to be a place you visited had become the environment you lived inside. You carry the memory of when that wasn't true. A time when connection had edges, when being present somewhere meant being absent everywhere else. That memory doesn't leave. Generational identity is supposed to feel like recognition. You see the shared story and something in you says, yes, that's mine. For you, it never quite landed that cleanly. You were categorized as Gen X, but the full shape of that identity didn't fit. Then you were absorbed into Millennial, and that didn't fit either. So you learned a different skill translation. moving between generational logics without ever fully inhabiting one. Understanding the analog skepticism of people older than you. Understanding the fluid self-presentation of people younger. But understanding isn't the same as belonging. And over time, that distinction leaves a mark. The quiet, internal conclusion, I can function anywhere. I don't originate anywhere. It's why the generational discourse always felt slightly beside the point. Boomers versus millennials. Gen X's vs Gen Z, you watch those arguments from a position of comprehension, seeing the logic on every side, claimed by none of it. There's genuine strength in that position. You can hold contradiction. You can move across difference with less friction than most, but there's a cost. Fewer mirrors, less cultural reinforcement, a sense that your particular experience doesn't form a complete and recognized shape. So you built continuity yourself from the inside, stitching together memories that shouldn't coexist into a self that somehow does. You are not a generation. You are what a transition looks like when a person has to live through it. The 90s handed you a specific kind of promise. The Cold War was over. The economy was expanding. Technology was arriving as a gift, not disruption. The story you were given was clean. Work hard, go to college, walk into a future that would be more open than the past. Children believe the world they inherit will hold them. You believed it too. Then the timing turned. The dot-com collapse hit as many of you were stepping across the threshold. First jobs, first semesters, first real plans. The future that had been used to motivate you evaporated. Then September 11th. Not in midlife, not after you'd stabilized at the exact moment of launch. First apartments, first independence, first attempts at building something. The message was immediate. The ground can shift overnight, and progress is not the same as safety. And before that had fully settled, 2008 arrived precisely when traditional adult milestones were supposed to be within reach. Property, family, career, consolidation. The floor moved again, stack those fractures together, and you get a particular kind of worldview. Not pessimism. Something more complicated than that. The hope is still there. You were raised on it, and it didn't entirely drain away. But underneath it runs a steady current of awareness. Systems fail, timing betrays, so you plan and you keep one eye on the exit, and you don't fully trust stability until you've tested its weight. The world didn't change before you were ready. Didn't wait until you were secure. It changed at precisely the moment you stepped forward to meet it. When you were young, communication had natural stopping points. Phones stayed in rooms. Messages waited. Work had a physical address you could leave. The day had a perimeter. Then adulthood arrived with a different set of terms. Email followed you out. Laptops followed you home. The smartphone dissolved the last remaining edge between presence and demand. And for you, unlike those who grew up after, this was not a natural evolution, it was an encroachment. You remembered the alternative. You'd lived in it. Part of your nervous system still expects intervals, pauses, stretches where no one can find you, and that's simply fine. The modern environment doesn't often grant them, so there's a low-grade friction that runs under daily life. The memory of bounded time, inside a reality of perpetual reach. The adjustment was never really about the technology. It was about the disappearance of you became an adult in a world where silence used to be the default. Now it has to be constructed deliberately, defended, scheduled. You look at your children's childhood and you're looking at something structurally different from your own. You remember afternoons without GPS, friendships settled in person, in real time, without anything recorded, autonomy that your parents didn't track because tracking wasn't an option. But the children you're raising have never known any of that. They were born into networks. Their social lives extend through devices. Their mistakes have a longer shelf life than yours did. Childhood, for them, is partially public from the beginning, and that creates a specific tension in you. Part of your internal standard for what childhood should be is still calibrated to the analog version. Outdoor freedom, unstructured time, the ability to be unknown, to experiment without documentation. You want to give them some version of what shaped you. The boredom, the space, the hours that belonged to no one. But the environment won't hold still for that. Remove them from digital life entirely and you've isolated them from their social world. Immerse them fully and you've handed them exposures you can't fully see. So you navigate, you set boundaries that didn't used to need setting. You explain risks that have no equivalent in your own history, algorithms, permanence, anonymous contact. Underneath all of it is something that rarely gets named. A kind of grief, not for your own past, but for the awareness that its conditions can't be rebuilt for them intact. You remember what childhood felt like before it was connected. And you're the last generation that will, at work, the generational gap runs quietly through most rooms. On one side, people shaped before digital acceleration, structured, hierarchical, loyal to process. On the other, people who grew up inside networks, fast, fluid, iterative, and you stand at the seam. You understand both operating systems, the analog logic of relationships built over time, of structure as stability, of showing up consistently mattering beyond deliverables, and the digital logic of speed, of adaptability, of identity that can be updated. So you do what you've always done. You translate to older leadership. You explain why constant availability corrodes something real, why a message sent late at night carries weight long after the sender has moved on. To younger colleagues, you explain why some institutional rhythms are deliberate, why trust doesn't scale instantly, why presence sometimes means something that output can't capture. This is not just professional range, it's the result of being formed across two distinct models of how organizations and societies function. You didn't choose to develop that flexibility, the transition built it into you. Bridges get taken for granted. They do their work invisibly, and nobody notices unless something breaks. That's the position you occupy in a lot of rooms. You're the connective tissue. Meetings land differently when you reframe them. Projects unlock when you translate competing expectations. Tension has somewhere to go when someone in the room understands both sides. You didn't apply for that role. Your experience simply spans what others experience as a divide. By midlife, the pressures converge. Above you, aging parents, living longer than previous generations, needing more coordination, more navigation of complex systems, more of your presence as the roles between you slowly reverse. Below you, children still forming, growing up inside more complexity and more exposure than you faced, needing guidance that extends well beyond basic care. And between those two pulls, your own life still consolidating. Still catching up on milestones that arrive later than the original plan suggested they should. Psychologists call this role strain. Multiple legitimate high-demand identities drawing from the same finite supply of attention, caregiver, parent, partner, worker, mediator, each one urgent. None of them optional, but there's a quieter layer under the exhaustion, a structural invisibility. You manage upward and downward simultaneously, but you're rarely positioned as the one who needs support. Pressure absorbs through you more than it accumulates toward you. So the fatigue isn't only from the volume of tasks, it's from the position, the middle, holding two generations in tension while still in the process of becoming yourself. You keep the timelines aligned. You carry the memory of what came before and the anticipation of what's coming. And gradually, a particular kind of tiredness builds. Not breakdown, just continuous load. The weight of holding everyone else's ground while your own remains unfinished. There is something you carry that is becoming genuinely scarce, not nostalgia. Something more specific than that. You have lived memory of a human pace that preceded constant connection. Days that had margins. Friendships that deepened without documentation. Thinking that formed slowly, privately, without an audience. The experience of being unreachable and that being ordinary, even comfortable. As the world moves further into continuous presence, that memory stops being merely personal. It becomes cultural evidence. Proof that attention once had breathing room, that boredom could open into something, that a self could take shape without being observed at every stage. You are among the last adults whose inner life began in genuine analog quiet. After your cohort, childhood starts already inside the network, already visible, already searchable. That's why this moment matters. Not as nostalgia for something lost, but as living testimony that another way of existing was real and that some of what it produced is still worth protecting. In a world that has largely engineered away stillness, the people who remember its value are not relics. They're a resource. If you recognize yourself in this, you are not between things. You are the record of how one world became another. And that is not a small thing to be